Welcome to Think for Yourself. Today, we have a very special guest. If you want to discuss Christianity, it's very easy. You wait a few months and someone will knock on your door. However, in the oldest surviving Abrahamic religion, there is no sales department, and many of the brilliant leaders within the community are not out there trying to convert anyone else. Luckily, Rabbi Zinger is a very outspoken, great guy. He has his own channel, and he is interested in preserving his community. And he is a master of both the Old Testament and the New Testament. He would call it the Torah, of course. And I want to learn today from this man and ask a few questions. Welcome, Rabbi Zinger.
Thank you for having me.
I'd like to start out with things that we agree on. I am a secular man, and we both mostly agree on the New Testament, and that's what a lot of your channel is about going into Christianity. And I would love to get a synopsis to start out with what you think the character presented in Christianity is. The story of Jesus. Do you think this is a historical character that has been embellished? Do you think he's completely folklore? What is your view? How did this character emerge?
Oh, that's really tough. That's a tough one. It's a tough one because Jesus didn't write anything, and the earliest surviving literature, the letters of Paul, written by a person who never met Jesus. He writes extensively. The church fathers thought that 14 out of the 27 books in the New Testament were written by him. We know now that it's not quite that many, but Paul wrote a lot, but Paul never met Jesus. The Gospels were written anonymously. We don't know who wrote them. The inscriptions, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are later assigned at the end of the 2nd century by Irenaeus, the Bishop of Lyon. So they're anonymously written. We don't even know who wrote them, but we know they're written by highly literate Christians at the end of the 1st century, so they're people who likely never met him either. So this really is the quest. So did somebody exist? Was there something? I think so. This is the humanities. This is not getting a blood test where they could be sure that you're O positive or whatever it is. This is, there are reasons to think that there was somebody who would have come from the Upper Galilee who, like many people at the time, thought the world was coming to an end. The Roman Empire had the Jews under their heel. There was no possibility that the Jews then were like today, where they can, fight an empire. It was just inconceivable. So the notion that the end of the world and the power of God was coming in an apocalyptic eschatology, not battles on the field, was widespread. We see that in the Christian Bible, the other guys running around. So I think it's much more likely than not that there was somebody from the northern Galilee, from Nazareth. No one would make that up. And I think it's likely because the Christian Bible goes out of its way. And I should just retract that. Matthew and Luke specifically go out of their way to assert that Jesus was born in the city of David. They both do. And they each independently come up with convoluted ways that are totally contradictory of how to arrange that in their infancy narratives, which are each 2 chapters. So if Jesus never existed, that means he's Casper the Friendly Ghost, like he's Bugs Bunny, like it's complete fiction. So why work that hard to get him to be born in the city of David? Why do you need Nazareth for? Why don't you just have him born in Bethlehem, grow up in Bethlehem? So in that everybody knew he really was from Nazareth, and everyone today speaks about Jesus as Jesus of Nazareth, not Jesus of Bethlehem. And that's how he's referred to in the Christian Bible, like famously, what good thing can come out of Nazareth, not Bethlehem. So there are reasons to believe that there was likely some figure back then who gained a very small following, like so many others. John the Baptist was no doubt a much more famous figure at the time. And then all that we know about today, almost everything is legendary, are accretions, layers upon layers of mythology. And it's very hard to figure out who was the original person because he didn't write anything. And the only methods for knowing anything about the past are very hard to develop, like dissimilarity, embarrassment, because we don't know what would be considered similar. So I think it's more likely than not that there was some sort of figure back then who did not claim to be the Messiah. I think that's a later development.
One other so there are different forms of what we call mythicism, which is the anti-historicist view that you might have heard there's some guy saying Jesus was a mushroom. There's people saying, like, there's all sorts of conspiracy theories, but one of them is that he's an amalgamation, a sort of meme, like an idea. People say the word Karen because there's an idea of angry ladies that yell at the manager. And so, for instance, the most similar character is Jesus ben Ananias, written by Josephus. He was said to, in 70 CE, be this mad man who knew that Romans were coming. He would say repeatedly, "Woe to the city of Jerusalem." And he had this poem he would repeat. They brought him to the Romans. They tried him, and then he was released. And then the Romans artillery had killed him. We have in the Talmud, like, I think 5 characters with the same name of Yeshua, all of them sort of heretical teachers. We have Jesus ben Damnius, who was a Jewish high priest. Like, there's all these characters, and they all have a similar name. And so there's an idea that this is an idea, like a concept, like just as popular as the word Muhammad, the name Muhammad. Jesus was this very popular name, and there just so happen to be so many similar leaders, you can call them charlatans or whatever, that were all sort of these characters, and that formed an idea. And then the other thing that Richard Carrier, my last speaker, says is he has the theory, which is not his own theory, but that if you dismiss all of the known forgeries of Paul, I think it's like Corinthians 2, and there's a few that we can see it's not him writing. If we look at the original stuff by Paul, there's a chance that he's just talking about a revelatory being that emerged from, he was just someone you would see in Revelations. And then he thinks that Mark took all of Paul's writings, and personified him by using Jesus ben Ananias because the structure is so similar. So that it's not that there's no Jesus, but that there were so many of these guys that sort of snowballed.
Let's talk about Paul's letters. And there's 6 letters of the 13 that are ascribed to him that say, Paul, that the author claims to be written by Paul. 6 of them are questionable, but 7 of them are referred to as indisputed letters. One of those indisputed letters, in fact, of the most indisputed letter, would be a letter like Galatians. So Paul actually begins the letter by saying that he went to Jerusalem, spent a couple of weeks there, and met with Jesus' brother, James. So who did he meet with if Jesus didn't exist? Look, this is like history, and it's the ancient world where very little is written, and there are no contemporaneous historians that wrote a word about him. There were historians like Philo, but he didn't think anything was striking. But I think if we can look at a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being he definitely was a historical figure, and 1 being, I think it's like an 8 that he probably did exist. There's a wide variety of reasons why most people think he's historical. The idea of a crucifixion, some to come up with that for a Messiah figure, but like, who was Paul meeting with if he did? It's hard to meet with someone's brother if he didn't exist. And the Nazareth thing is very, very compelling. Why? It means if it's completely, it means there's no Jesus who was born in Nazareth, then why work so hard to have him go from Nazareth to Bethlehem in Luke's version of the account? Matthew's reversed. And then go back to Nazareth. Like, why not just have him born and stay in Bethlehem? So really, it's the corruption in the Christian Bible. It's the lies, it's just the nonsense that actually reveals, it's counterintuitive, that there probably is a historical figure that they're working really hard to rework. One interesting thing you said about angry, Jesus does come off gratuitously angry in the Christian Bible. He's like just angry a lot. He's angry, people don't even know why. It could be that points to something, because it's sort of odd but he's angry at Nicodemus and speaks to him like Nicodemus is just trying to figure out what's going on here. And Jesus just is blowing it and going, why are you, like, be nice to the guy. The guy kind of is on board with you. Or the leper in a very famous manuscript in the beginning of Mark. But I think it's just more likely. It's like that some hysterical woman would have said, he appeared to me. So I lived in Indonesia for a while, and I remember when a very famous pastor in 2016 died, and all these women, only women, I don't know why, and feminists, don't be angry, but it's Mary's coming to women. Women are seeing these things, typically, women and kids. So I can very easily see that he dies, and then some woman, Mary Magdalene, who we're told in the Christian Bible and Luke had demons, which meant she was probably mentally ill, claims he, and that's where it all developed. That would, I think, would be the easiest way to reconstruct what occurred there. And that he never claimed to be the Messiah would work out very well, because it seems in the Gospels, particularly Mark, that Jesus being the Messiah is a secret. First 8 chapters. And we find that in Matthew 2, Matthew 16:20. Like, why is it a secret? And why in Matthew 28, when they go to the Galilee to see Jesus, some of his disciples doubted it. So, like, why put that in? So it's clearly an apologetic that people are saying, wait, the guy never claimed to be the Messiah. The Gospels now say it was always meant to be that way.
For us laymen, what the Messiah was supposed to be, because there seems to be a huge difference between the Christian version of that and what is said in the Torah. Like, what you guys were expecting is not this character, Jesus, the Son of God, that we're supposed to, like, right? The prophecy is quite different. The Son of Man.
It couldn't be more different. In Tanakh, we have hundreds of passages of the Messianic. Not one of them describe a miracle. So in the Christian Bible, he's just running around doing miracles. He's like Superman. Clark Kent suddenly appears, as Superman. In Tanakh, he is the final king, Davidic king, who ushers in a time he rebukes, he teaches the world, and people listen to him very carefully. And as a result, what's happening in Gaza and Ukraine and in Yemen right now, war comes to an end. Nations will put down their implements of war and transform them into implements of agriculture. There'll be a worldwide knowledge of God. All of the Jews will return to the land of Israel, all of them. Before the Messiah comes, Zechariah says that the Jews already will have returned and in battle defeated all of its enemies. There will be a resurrection of the dead and a building of a third temple in Jerusalem, where I am, and finally ending with the resurrection of the dead. So there's just no relationship at all between the Mashiach in Tanakh and what you find in the Christian Bible. What you find in the Christian Bible is very much the product of mythology. Even the way he looks. Like, if I was standing with you, like we're in a 7-Eleven, and you and me are standing together waiting to pay for something, right? And I say to you, don't look right now, but the guy behind us looks exactly like Jesus, right? Right? Now, so you don't turn around, but in your mind, you have an idea, what does he look like? He's not a short, fat, bald guy, right? I mean, you know, before you look, you're gonna when you eventually turn around, you're gonna see a guy who looks like he belongs on a GQ magazine, gorgeous hair, no split ends, perfect BMI, looks fantastic, looks like a Viking, not like a Jew. So, I mean, what is that? He looks like Hercules. He looks like all the gods. I mean, they all look that way. So that it's man's futile effort to create God in his image. That's what it is. It has nothing at all to do with the Mashiach and Tanakh.
So you mentioned Zechariah. Interesting enough, it goes back to this idea that there are several similar characters in the Joshua the high priest in Zechariah 3:1-9 describes a vision of Joshua the high priest. Some people say that this character is similar and might have been an inspiration for the embellishments. What do you think about that?
Just total nonsense. So here's the story. It's a really simple story. And I want to say to the viewers, Zechariah is not the easiest book in the Hebrew Bible to understand, but it's not complicated. This is one of 8 visions. It's really simple. The Second Temple was built with 2 leaders. One was Yehoshua, who was the nephew of Ezra, and the other one was Zerubbabel. It's really simple. 2 fellows. One is a priest. One is from the house of David. Zerubbabel's from the house of David. Now, what happens is Yehoshua's son marries a non-Jewish woman. It's really simple. But to find that, you have to go to Ezra chapter 10, verse 18. It's not here. What happens is Satan sees this as an opportunity to accuse Yehoshua. It's really simple. He brings him before God. And that's what it means. He had dirty clothing because he himself was an upstanding, righteous person. However, he had a blemish. That is, he had a kid who did the wrong thing. And God rebukes Satan and says, go. This guy is fine. Take off the dirty clothing. Give him clean clothing instead, a proper hat for a priest. There's really nothing complicated. So unlike Eli, who was a much earlier period, that's the tabernacle period, whose sons were corrupt right in front of Eli's face, and Eli was held accountable because he looked the other way, Yehoshua wasn't held accountable. That's the vision. It's a very simple vision. And then God says if you and your companions continue to act in a way that's upright, all's going to be great with you. And that's it. It's complicated because people read chapters out of context that people don't like to read, frankly. They'd rather go watch a movie, and they don't read the text in context, so they have no clue what's going on. It just sounds like a weird story.
The New Testament is cake. It's dessert. It's so... I'm not surprised that you're so easily memorizing the New Testament, because if you can master the Torah, it's very beginner-friendly reading.
This part of Zechariah is difficult. It's not rocket science. It's not like opening the book of Joshua where everything just... There are visions here, but it's really simple what's happening here. It's nothing to do with Jesus. But I think, for the viewers, I want to make a point. The reason why Christians have to appeal to... So this is Yehoshua, the son of Yehotzadok, okay? Totally, it's Yehoshua, the son of Yehotzadok. And Yehotzadok was the brother of Ezra. It's really very simple. Nothing to do with Jesus, none of that stuff. Now, why do Christians do this? Like, why are they looking for shadows and, think that's an illusion? Why? Because you know and I know that if anywhere in the Hebrew Bible it said something like, God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, so that anyone would believe in him would not perish but have everlasting life, John 3:16, something like that, just something remotely resembling that, like the Messiah is God's son is going to come, he's going to die and rise on the third day. It's just something like that. They wouldn't need Zechariah 3. The reason they go for these texts that have nothing, totally convoluted, is because they got nothing else. That's why they have to do this kind of stuff.
So in the Talmud, there's a theory that people like Paul were trying to obey the part of the Talmud. I think it's Sanhedrin. Basically to tell the Gentiles to obey the 7 Noahide laws, give them something. They're not to be studying the actual Torah, that's forbidden, but provide them some guidance. And so some people theorize that it started out as a sect of Jewish people trying to help the Gentiles. These diasporas were happening. They're in these new places. Hey, Greek guy that I now live next to, here are these stories. And so like people think it emerged with the good intention to obey that part of the Talmud, to tell them, do not worship idols, do not curse God, do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not eat flesh. And the Christian 10 Commandments are a little different. They are like, it almost seems like that was the initial intention, and then it ironically became anti-Semitic.
I don't think so. I think the 7 Noahide laws are found in Acts 15, but that's because of a major schism in the early church. That's no doubt historical. So in Acts 15, we discover that there were many Christians who thought that in order to be a Christian, now they didn't call themselves Christians, but we're going to do that because it's conventional, that thought if you want to be a Christian, you have to first convert to Judaism, circumcision, everything. So there's an ecumenical council in which it was Peter, Paul, they're all there. It is resolved that if non-Jews keep the 7 Noahide laws, they don't use that term, but you see the laws as you've articulated, don't eat the flesh of that was offered to idols, which Paul is going to just blow that off in 1 Corinthians 8 through 10. Then you're good. That's all you need to do to be if you're not Jewish, to be a good Christian, nothing else. But I think the movement began at a time that's hard to imagine, and that the first third of the first century, the Jews were living under a brutal occupation of the Roman Empire. And there were battles, and people were just, how are we going to get rid of the Roman Empire? They're huge. And only God can do this. And people were running around saying the end of the world is coming. And if it was not for Paul, Christianity would have gone nowhere. Paul does something remarkable. And I don't mean that in a good way, but he does something remarkable, and that is he synchronizes. He synchronizes pagan ideas with Jewish ideas. And so one point your viewers must know is that in the first century, the only monotheism in the world was Judaism. That was there was nothing else. No one else believed in only one God, and there's nothing else. Okay, so Judaism was popular. People were converting to Judaism in fairly large numbers. However, people knew that the Jews were not just a religion, but we were also a nation. And in order to become a Jew, it's not that easy. And to keep the commandments is not the easiest thing. Circumcision is certainly not. So what happens if you're offered the following? If you offer that you could essentially become the same, equal to the Jew, and you don't have to keep any commandments. And the whole reason the commandments were given is to show that you're a sinner. And you're all one in the body of Christ. There is no Jew or Gentile, man or woman, slave or free man. So, wow. So what Paul did was he's bringing Greco-Roman ideas, trying to synchronize it with Judaism, but he's essentially taking away the two stumbling blocks of what may prevent someone from becoming a Jew. Number one, people don't want to keep all those commandments. Today it's very easy to be a religious Jew, but then it may have not been that easy. And number two is you are heir to the promises if you're a Jew, if you just believe in Jesus. So bingo. That's what is his ability, because Christianity is inventing nothing. It's borrowing everything and then synchronizing everything. I mean, the Greeks didn't invent anything besides theater, but they're taking from all over the Levant and way beyond and transforming it into a way that what we know as Western civilization, just synchronizing that all. Paul is going to go with that. And once Paul comes in and synchronizes these ideas that were very attractive at the time, so bang, that would open up floodgates. And that's why his version of Christianity is adopted. That's why Galatians, in a way, is the most important of his books. I mean, Romans and Galatians, but Galatians, he really just very clearly lays all this stuff out. You don't have to keep the law. Don't be an idiot. Just be a good person. Don't get circumcised. That won't help you. And you're in the body of Christ. Bingo. You're set. So that Paul's the guy. Without Paul, he's the number one most important figure, not Jesus. Whoever Jesus was, he didn't do this. Paul did.
To add to that notion, my last speaker actually goes over how some of the so like there's an example in Mark where Mark takes something Paul wrote and makes Jesus say it. So like Jesus is an amalgam of so many characters, including Paul himself. He says something about the render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. Paul says that himself, and then Mark has Jesus say that. And so, and then to add to that, like the resurrection resembles about 10 other characters in other religions, including the Babylonian goddess Inanna. The taking the wine and bread ritual stems from the Osiris cult, where they would eat a little bit of bread, drink. The Dionysus cult in Greek culture, where the wine god, who just so happened to be crucified too, and was the son of the main god. These very similar characters have all been bundled into one. So I agree that there's a lot of borrowed history.
It's all synchronized. That's what he's done. And then with an outline of Judaism. It's absolutely the Eucharist, which you refer to, eating the body of the gods and drinking the blood. That's so early. That comes up in Paul's letters in 1 Corinthians 11. So that's, they're basically cherry picking from the pagan world and ideas from Judaism and synchronizing it, and that would take off. That's why I was like, it's why that's a religion that would grow exponentially. And then Constantine makes Christianity a licit and preferred religion, and that was it.
Another thing that makes it a very appealing sect is so not only is it less arduous, less rules, you get forgiven for what like everything is just easier. Paul's a great salesman. The other thing that gives them appeal is this idea that Christianity is peaceful. Everyone loves each other. It has this sort of Buddhist reputation, despite what you said earlier, Jesus being actually sort of mean. He says all sorts of things. He damns you to hell. He does say negative things, but his reputation is that he's the nicest guy of all time, and that the New Testament changed everything. The covenant is now good, and a lot of Christians sort of abandon the old, like that's the old covenant. I don't have to argue for what you read in Leviticus. I don't want to talk about numbers. That's old school, brutal stuff. I want to just talk about this guy, Jesus. So what do you think about this idea that the original Judaism is this violent sort of,
I think that it's so telling that Paul was an outsider rather than an insider, as he claims. He's constantly saying, I'm not a liar. Well, why are you saying it that much? Because he lied a lot. And he lied about his CV, claiming to be a Pharisee. He wasn't. He is totally clueless of what the struggle religious Jews have. Now, religious Jews, Orthodox Jews, our struggle is not keeping kosher or keeping the Sabbath. That's all very easy. What's challenging, and you can see this, if you open up the book of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, the criticism almost entirely is how do you treat other people? How do you treat people who are not as fortunate as you are? How do you, the weak, the widow, the orphan, the naked, the hungry? Keeping Shabbos is like easy. So Paul is coming from as an outsider. He really is clueless. And it would be very hard, very difficult to find an example of all of the prophets part of the Hebrew scriptures. I mean, after you're done with the 5 books of Moses, to find where Jews are criticized for not keeping the Sabbath or keeping kosher. You could find it, by the way. You can. But you would have to really know your stuff. It's in the corner. The big issue is, are you treating each other with dignity? How are the wealthy dealing? Are you taking care of the poor? So Paul is way off on this one. He's clueless. I have theories on what bothered Paul. Something was on his mind. Something about the Jewish law bothered him terribly. And I think I think when Paul said that, when he learned about the law in Romans 7, he realized he was a sinner. Like, why was he promoting celibacy as a virtue? So I think Paul had a very specific problem with Torah, and he had to address sin. It would overwhelm him, but he was clueless on the struggle of the average religious Jew. The struggle was not, I'm dying to eat pork, I'm dying to eat bacon, what am I going to do? I'm stuck. That's not the issue. So he's a real outsider, and I think, but he was addressing non-Jews, and that's the world that he was familiar with. He came from Tarsus, a place of Western philosophical reflection. He was clueless.
And, before the internet, I think the largest book of all time, the Jerusalem Talmud, has a lot of other things that, are even more problematic. But I sometimes wonder, because I get different answers, like some practitioners see it as, it's just this collection of different rabbis' thoughts, and it's not something to, it's just their interpretations. And then there's others where it's like, that's just as good as the Torah. Well, how do you feel? And I won't read, they're all out there. Anyone can read the sort of problematic, controversial Talmudic quotes, but how do you feel about that? Whether it's the violence there, or especially the new thing is people referencing the anti-Goyim stuff. The Goyim is this and that. How do you feel about that sort of controversy?
Actually, the Babylonian Talmud is by far the largest piece of literature that we have from the ancient world, much larger than the Jerusalem Talmud. And it's a collection of many things, a collection of people's ideas at the time of medicine. It's not germane to us. What is germane is Jewish law. So the Talmud, so what happens is people who really, really don't like us, so when the Talmud refers to people who worship idols, it's called an akum, which is an acronym for people who bow down to the stars. They just change it for non-Jews. So that's completely not the case.
Now, it's not genetic, you're saying. It's
right. So what the anti-Semites do is they just say the Gentiles are Christians, and it doesn't say that at all. It specifically idol worshipers. Or, for example, the Talmud deals with the question of when the Egyptians were, I'm just talking about the stuff that's out there on the internet, when the Egyptians were pursuing the Jews, as the Jews are now coming to the sea, which is going to part for them, and they're riding on horses. So the question is like, where do they get horses from? I thought all the animals died in the plague of animals just get sick and die. Well, as it turns out, if you were like a better Egyptian, you were worried and you put your animal inside rather than leave them outside. So the Talmud then deduces from there that even the best of the Egyptians, who were a little scared of the God of Israel, that put their animal inside the barn rather than leave it out where they'd be vulnerable to the plague, even the best of those Egyptians were wicked, were evil, because they ultimately supply the cavalry for those who pursue the Jews. So if you're an anti-Semite, what you do is you go, oh, even the best of the Gentiles are horrible. Well, no, that's not what it's saying. It's completely out of context. Let me extrapolate. I'm going to just take the worst examples in the Talmud. So I want to steel man this rather than straw man this. Okay, all right. In American law, this happened frequently. You have a cop. He's walking down the street. He's got a beat. And he sees this guy, and for whatever he doesn't like him, and he looks suspicious, okay? So the guy goes into his house, and the cop goes, I'm just going to just bang the door wide open. I'm sure this guy's a drug dealer. He looks, I don't like the color of his skin, whatever it is. There's something about him, and he just busts the door down. And sure enough, he goes in the house, and he sees 10 kilos of coke, right? This happens a lot. Cops just do a search and then they find, a ton of heroin in a guy's trunk, but there wasn't a probable cause. Well, guess what? I mean, it gets thrown out, right? I mean, because the police officer did an illegal search because there wasn't a probable cause, there wasn't a warrant, the guy goes free, and that can't be used as evidence. Right? So imagine someone's reading these statutes. In America, in the United States, this is a very big deal. This is a very, very big deal about probable cause, about having a warrant. You can't just invade someone's privacy on a hunch, right? Okay. So would someone reading out of context say, oh, I guess in New York State, it's a good thing to have cocaine? No, it's not. It's just saying the Talmud is addressing very specific questions about very difficult issues. And going what level of warrant is necessary, what when would evidence be thrown out? But doesn't mean that the Talmud is saying it's a good thing. It's just saying, or for instance, a girl who's less than 3 years old, the Talmud is making a medical statement about her that her hymen, if it was damaged, would regenerate. Okay? So if a hymen of a girl who's under 3 years old was damaged somehow, it will regenerate, which it will. Children can get huge cuts. This finger of this hand, when I was a baby, was almost completely cut off. My mother went to the hospital with it was just hanging on by a piece of skin. And they just, I don't know, they sewed it together, and now you can't tell. So the Talmud is simply saying that it's like nothing happened because children, their bodies regenerate. Well, if you're the Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, you're going to go, oh, the Talmud is advocating pedophilia. No, it's not. It's just making a medical statement. The Talmud is enormous. The Talmud, it contains within it some of the greatest works of morality known in human history. It contains the oral Torah. It contains opinions. Now, one thing in Jewish law, like people who study constitutional law, they're not just interested in what the opinion of the Supreme Court, like let's say a case is 6-3. They also want to know what was the reasoning that the dissenting justices used. So every opinion is recorded, both those that are accepted and those that are not, because it's not the majority opinion. The Talmud contains all of those things, and if it's studied out of context, you'll have a field day with it. You will become an anti-Semite. You can believe anything you want to because you're reading these texts out of context. Like in American law, you'd think, well, if you can't lock a guy up for having 10 kilos of coke, well, maybe coke. There was a cop in Florida on 95 who he was giving out speeding tickets to just black people who were driving up 95, right? So eventually they realized every single guy the guy pulled over was black. Now the black guy was speeding, right? But he just wouldn't pull over white guys. Well, they threw it all out because he was using. That doesn't mean that it's good to go 85 miles an hour in a 65-mile-an-hour zone. right? But you can rip that out of context. But he was, very specifically prosecuting people because of their race, as an example. So the Talmud is full of that kind of stuff, very vulnerable to people who are bad faith actors.
Yeah, and with today's technology, I mean, it used to be a rabbi with your job in the 1800s would never have to answer for any of this, because I mean, even if I could read the Talmud back then, I wouldn't have the internet to just give me top 10 most controversial Talmudic, like it's a new job for you to have to answer for that. So I'm impressed that I'm thankful that you do have answers for that. The next topic of controversy is there are, just like I said, that there are parallels with Jesus. There are Ananda, Osiris, all of these characters that they call them dying and rising gods. They are killed, then come back to life. It gives the reader a sense of less fear over death. It's a great archetype. It's just like the Persian, it just always works throughout different cultures. There are accusations similarly to the Torah that certain stories, and I know you've spoken on this, but just to do it again, there's the Epic of Gilgamesh as a flood. There is the creation of humanity and the Babylonian creation myth that resembles it. The Sumerian myth of Adapa resembles Genesis. And we could go down like the birth of Moses resembles Sargon from the Mesopotamian, mostly Babylonian related pre-Abrahamic Mesopotamian beliefs, like the Code of Hammurabi resembles the Ten Commandments, and so on. I'm sure you heard them all. How do you feel about these? Is it because you guys have restored these things and that validates your beliefs? Like if there was actually a flood, you would see an older religion talk about a flood too?
Of course, this is like such a no-brainer. It means if 9/11 really happened, let's say in 2,000 years from now, so people would go, well, we see this 9/11 event described in all sorts of literature. Now, it's true, some of them say that these crazy extremist Muslims did it, but there are others that say the Jews did it, and so others say that G.W. Bush actually took down Tower 7, but they're obviously talking about the same story. So I would think that if there was historically a flood that took place in 1656 after creation, that's 400 years before Abraham. Yeah, so about 400 years before Abraham. If there was no other mention of a flood with one family being rescued, now the stories are not identical, but the thing that there's a massive flood, a cataclysmic flood, a family survives on a ship. If we didn't find any other corresponding story like that in other literature, I'd say we've got a problem. In that, almost every culture in the world speaks about obviously the same story. That points to the historicity of it. Yeah, of course, we believe that our version of it is exactly correct, and they've got it a little bit messed up, and that's fine. So I don't even understand why, of course, Noah knew that it was a bad idea to murder, and that you would have codes, for instance, time of Abraham, who lived, again, about 400 years after Noah. So, I mean, Abraham was born, let's say, in about the year 2000. So of course, it was known that it's a very bad idea to kill somebody because you had Cain and Abel and everything else. And why would the flood occur? Because they were raping women and killing people. I mean, so it happens to be, I don't know, there's really an easy way for me to explain this. I mean, these tablets, many of them are younger than the Torah. It means they're let's talk about the Gilgamesh tablet that's describing an event that's 4,000 years, that's putatively 4,000 years old. But the actual physical tablet is, let's say, 2,700 years old. So the actual tablet is 500 years younger than the Torah, which is about 3,300 years old. So I could, if I wanted to, sort of be like, just sort of fight this like a boxer, go, well, they knew about the Torah that was very accessible, and then they made a story up like it, but I'm not going to do that. It's not necessary. I mean, so you have to be very careful when you say the characters are portrayed to have lived during this time. But how old is that tablet specifically? What is the tablet dated to? Very frequently, the tablet is not 3,300 years old, which means the whole argument collapses. But I want to steelman this and concede it all and go, well, yeah, of course they knew. Now, the Code of Hammurabi there are some similarities, but there are quite a few differences between Jewish law. But let's just concede it all for this sake. Noah was righteous in his generation. Well, what did he do to be righteous? There were the commandments that are pre-Synodic laws. So this is all really simple.
One thing I actually stumbled across, it's funny, as a secular, you can call me atheist, sometimes when I'm researching things with my intention to have my narrative, which is what we all do when we're researching, I have my set belief or lack thereof, and sometimes I get something I'm like, oh, that's not what I wanted. I actually have something to offer if you haven't already seen this. So when I was looking, I wanted all of the similar fables from other religions to demonstrate, oh, look, see, it's in this one, therefore. And then I come across the fact that in the South American, Mesoamerican, which are completely separate, isolated, they have the flood myth. And then a lot of people, like a sort of Jungian Jordan Peterson guy, might think, oh, well, that's part of the collective unconscious of humanity, and there might be some other reason for that. But I got to say, that doesn't fit my idea. I'm like, it almost goes full circle to where it's like, oh, then now there's too many flood myths. There's no way that the Incans and the Aztecs stole from Babylon. Right. And so, and then there's a part of me that thinks like, there probably was a flood. I don't think it was precisely accurately described in any of these religions, but I don't doubt that even scientists say that there was an ice age, there was huge cataclysmic fluctuations of the sea level. And so that makes sense to me, that there was some intrinsic value to this story.
Yeah. The only thing is the stories are too similar. And, you have to ask yourself the question of, in that we find a cataclysmic worldwide flood, one family saved from this flood on a ship, and then they do get different in many different ways. So that would be consistent with a historical event rather than one that's made up. You're right. And Judaism is unique. Moreover, I'll just share this with you, that for us, what's most important, the gold standard in our faith, is predictability, that the Hebrew Bible was able to make predictions about history. And like when Einstein made predictions about things that were that were counterintuitive, that things that you could not see had a gravitational pull and affected the reason why planets move in an odd way. And they had to wait for years when there was a solar eclipse in order to confirm what Einstein had said earlier was actually accurate. Well, Judaism is very much about the predictions in Tanakh that the Jewish people are an eternal nation. We would be exiled from the land. We would suffer greatly in our exile, but one day we would return. See, in the Hebrew Bible, you'd be very hard-pressed to be threatened with going to hell or going to heaven. There is the resurrection mentioned, but very rarely and not a threat. But the Torah is filled with predictions about a nation that, despite vicissitudes, everyone would hate you, everyone would exile you. When the King James Bible was written published in 1611, there were no Jews in England. They were expelled long before that. So what we're saying is that the book has made predictions about history, about things that no author could have known. And we appeal to the world to notice the people of Israel, the restoration of the nation of Israel, the promises, and that it's that predictive quality. You may not know how. Like when they figured out that cigarette smoking is bad for you, they didn't know why, but there were scientists who saw, whoa, people who smoke seem to be just dying, and it looks like it may not be a good idea. So Judaism is saying we may not, I'm not God's manager, I'm a salesman, but just look at history, look back, and that's the language of Deuteronomy 4, and you see that these predictions are just counterintuitive. That Persia would be identified by Ezekiel. Persia was a benign empire at the time. Cyrus was a nice guy to the Jews. He was kind of like a Donald Trump figure. But Persia is ultimately going to be arch enemy at the end of the days. Where do they get that from? And that's what's very compelling to people, is the nature of the Jewish people and the predictions about us. And here we are today.
Speaking of the Persian group, so there is another theory that when the Persians had conquered Judea, they heavily influenced the religion. There is the idea of Satan came from their dual God belief, because they were almost monotheistic. They had two gods, the good God and the bad God. And there is the thought that the Torah before that didn't have that, and they didn't have the resurrection. I actually have, my last speaker had said that, so I wanted to just let you react to that. That basically he outlined the Persian influence, that they introduced the resurrection and the Satan figure, and then he said that the Hellenistic separation, the Judaism from the Hellenistic sect, that heavily influenced it too. So what do you think about this idea that Judaism has changed significantly?
So as it turns out, Zoroastrianism, which you're referring to, is exactly the opposite of Judaism. It was a dualistic religion, a god of light, a god of darkness, and Moses Germain, they are independent agents. That's what's critical. In Judaism, there's a Satan, but Satan does exactly what God tells him to. In our tradition, the oldest book in the Hebrew scriptures is the book of Job, and it's about Satan asking God for permission to test this man. God tells Satan, this is what you can do, this is what you can't do. That story cannot exist in Zoroastrian mythology, because the dark god, the bad god, the malevolent god, whatever you want to call him, he's independent. The Satan in the Christian Bible, he's not called Lucifer, but now knows is an enemy of God. He's not doing whatever God says. So superficially, because they seem similar, but they're very different, God actually had to create Satan, and there's actually a passage which is no doubt an attack on Zoroastrianism, Isaiah 45, verse 7, where very specifically God says, I created evil so that you can have free will. Choose life that you may live, Deuteronomy 30. So Zoroastrianism is precisely the opposite of Judaism, in that it's highly dualistic, whereas Judaism is saying there is one God, there's nothing else, and the evil in the world, the evil inclination in the world, is created by God so that you can have free will, so that you can so that you could be a good person, so that virtue is possible. So it's precisely the opposite. It's interesting you bring it up with relation to Cyrus, because it's precisely in Isaiah 45:1, where God says that Cyrus is my anointed to tell the Jews to go back. He then says, and do not, I'm paraphrasing, but do not think he's a great guy. He doesn't know my name. And he attacks Zoroastrianism right there in Isaiah 45:7, that everything, calamity, evil, it all is from me. It's not dualistic at all.
Christianity had diverted back to that sense.
Yes, very much
the
so.
modern Christian, we have to also remind ourselves, the modern Christian does not read the Bible nor understand it when they try to, not trying to be rude, but almost every regular, normal Christian, even some guys that are door knocking, have they seem to be distant from what I'm reading in the Bible, but there's this idea, this new Satan that is literally a god himself. I have had Christians tell me, "Oh, everything bad is Satan's fault." And it's like, it is not only dual, it's polytheistic. I mean, Jesus is another character. We have the Holy Spirit. We have all. Whereas I can't really make the same accusation about Judaism in its current form because, yeah, there are people like Moses who demonstrated miracles to some extent, but it's through God. He's clearly acting through God. So it is at least consistently monotheistic. Modern Christianity has to jump through so many hoops to convince everyone that it's still being monotheistic because they have those writings intact in the Old Testament. So they're forced to figure that out. They have these new characters, but it's strange how polytheistic it could become and still be called monotheistic.
Right.
The fastball this is, I think, the most, I haven't seen you speak on this matter, but I'm sure you've heard it all. But this is what I consider to be the most difficult to ask, because it's stuff that it's not easy for anyone to retort like specifically. So I want to just read out a few quotes from different things and just let you sort of vaguely respond to them, because it's way too much to specifically go into each. But basically, the Torah is not only providing morality and answers for ontological questions, it also is a history book. It provides the history of your people. And so there are obviously a lot of archaeologists and scholars who argue against those historical things. And so I'll just read a few quotes and then you can just, I'll let you go and respond to them all. So Thomas Thompson: biblical narratives are not historical accounts, but theological constructs shaped by later communities to provide identity and continuity. There is no evidence that Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob ever lived, nor is there any evidence that the Exodus or the conquest of Canaan, as described in the Bible. Israel Finkelstein, archaeologist, said something similar. The biblical story of the conquest of Canaan by Joshua is a later ideological narrative. Archaeological surveys show no signs of widespread destruction or sudden cultural change in Canaan during the late Bronze Age. William Dever said, the patriarchal narratives are not historical. They reflect later traditions and theological agendas written long after the supposed events, and so on. And there's DNA evidence from, I think there was a study in 2020 where they were saying the pre-Bronze era skeletons they found in the special tomb in Israel were matching the current native, like people today in Israel seem to have similar DNA to people found prior to the supposed Exodus. So they're saying basically that they were always there, but there was a sect of people that decided to say, no, we are special because we come from Egypt and we came here, but these people are most of the consensus is that they were always there. They are literally native to Canaan. And how do you feel about these?
Sure. So the Torah is my family album. It's a story about my family. I'm a Kohen. Aaron, the brother of Moses, was my great-grandfather. There are hundreds of thousands of Kohanim, priests, alive today. The study is in Kohanim have a unique Y chromosome that goes back to a common ancestor because we're all descendants of Aaron. So for people to ignore something so simple that, Judaism is, I'll say this, but I'm going to get pushback, we're the only ethno-religious group in the world. The Druze are kind of like us, but not really. But that's a story of our family. And at the University of New Mexico, they were able to take Kohanim as an example and find that we have a common ancestor. One other point I think should be made. Archaeology, if archaeology is a hard science, right, why do they argue with each other so much? Like, why is there so much disagreement? I mean, is it like there's no one who's saying that cigarette smoking, no doctor saying cigarette smoking is good for you. Well, the reason is that archaeology, as one famed archaeologist said, is like having a 1,000-piece puzzle. All you have is 3 pieces and no picture. And what you see, you have almost nothing is left from the Bronze Age. We have almost nothing. Like, imagine taking a blank page, which represents all of the literature that existed 3,500 years ago, right? How much of that is with us today? If you could, with a pen, draw a circle, you wouldn't even be able to make a dot. That means we have almost nothing left. Almost nothing survives, because nothing would survive if it was on organic material. Nothing. If it was written on papyrus, it was written on parchment, vellum, it would be gone. It would never survive. The only thing that could possibly survive if it was chiseled into stone, and somehow we actually do have the oldest part of the Torah, the oldest surviving section of the 5 books of Moses, did survive, and it's about 2,700 years old because it was etched into silver. It's called the Ketef Hinnom, and it is on display at the Israel Museum. That's First Temple period. With all these guys running around that the Torah is, 2,500 years, we have a segment of Numbers chapter 6. We have it. So what is really going on here? Because what archaeologists are doing is they have a dearth of information and they're trying to reassemble it. That explains why, I'm not going to mention names because I don't want to get sued, but that's why you have the same characters in archaeology who are are minimalists and are just routinely attacking the histories of the Torah. And you have these whole other archaeologists that are interpreting the same material and are saying this demonstrates the veracity of Torah because they're just reinterpreting the very small amount of literature. Like, why is it the same? If this is really a science, and it's difficult because all these people are called doctor, they have PhDs in archaeology. So we're used to going to the doctor, and if, God forbid, we ever had to have a test done and sent to a pathologist, God forbid, we really want to know that the guy is sure that it's negative or positive, whatever it is. So but this is not the same thing. It's not like they know, but what rather we have in view is people that already possess a worldview. And then they interpret the very little information that they have in a way that fits their pre-existing worldview. And that's why you have this one person who's a PhD, and he's always coming out with ideas that the Torah has it wrong. And you have this other archaeologist going, no, this demonstrates the veracity of it. Are they liars? No. They're just operating out of a worldview. And, that's why you have newspapers, right? We know some newspapers have a certain worldview, and that's why Kamala Harris is portrayed in one paper as though she's a genius, and another paper like she's a babbling idiot. Well, which is it? They both graduated Columbia School of Journalism. It's because they have a different worldview. We know that. This is transparent. So that's what's happening in archaeology. This is not like we have 20% of what was written. We don't. We have just almost nothing. And people are just trying to reassemble it and say, we know. You don't know. You could say that it's consistent with this or this, but there's just too little sample size. The only reason we have Qumran, the material, is because it was the perfect place. It was hidden away in caves in the Dead Sea, where the temperature just doesn't change. It's desert. I've been there 100 times. It's not that far from where I live. It's just always the weather's the same. It's dry. It was in a dark place, and that managed to survive 2,000 years. But it was a perfect, good storm that preserved it. No one found it until the 1940s. So I would just say that when archaeologists are writing books and they seem to contradict each other, there's a reason. It's because the same people who have a certain worldview interpret the very little that we possess in a certain way because it fits into their narrative. That's all. This is not complex. This is not rocket science.
one thing I want to remark is, as a non-religious person, I used to be a Catholic as a schoolboy, and growing up and seeing all the chaos that's involved right now with different Abrahamic beliefs and whatnot, there is this notion in my head when I see the quotes that I've given you, and it's very easy for me to attribute the chaos, the violence to these writings, whether it be what I see from Islam, Christian terrorism, and neocon politics, and all these different people that I mean, I think it's 60% of the planet have an Abrahamic belief. And so, like, it's very easy for me to say, oh, if I could just get everyone to throw their books out, everyone would get along. But then when I meet people like you who are more closely related to these books than anyone, and even Islamic people and Christians that I've met that are reading this book more than anyone, these books, they're not violent. They're some of the kindest people you'll ever meet. So clearly, I cannot attribute just the books themselves to the conflicts, and they seem to persist. I mean, there are several countries that are absent of Abrahamic beliefs and yet are still violent, and so it clearly is a human condition. But yeah, it's just there is something whenever I do speak with someone that is heavily religious, I'm always reminded that there's no correlation. They don't become more violent the more religious they get.
We do not know each other. We've never spoken before. I don't know you. But I imagine that people have hurt you in your life. Don't respond. Just think this through with me. You've been hurt in your life, betrayed in your life, I'm sure. Okay. I'm fairly certain, I'm reasonably certain that it was not a cashier in Walmart, but rather someone very close to you. It's not strangers that hurt you. It's the people that are close to you that can hurt you. So of course it would be reasonable that it's the similarity of our religions that would be consistent with disagreement, especially, now I'm going to say this, especially because there's an Occam's razor in all this, and the viewers need to be very aware of this. Occam's razor means that anytime you introduce a new hypothesis, it's just less likely to be true, okay? So Judaism is you call it whatever you want. I mean, Judaism is the original monotheism, Abrahamic monotheism. And in fact, all of Christianity, all of Islam believes that. They all believe that Torah is from God and the Jews were chosen, and for whatever reason, things change. So anytime you have a new hypothesis, it just has to be less likely to be true. And that's what all other Abrahamic religions are, is they're accretions introducing another hypothesis. Let me reason this through with you in the following way, make it easy to understand. That means whatever you would assign Orthodox, lowercase o, Orthodox Christianity as a chance of being a true religion, right? Whatever you think, you'd say, I'll give it 1% chance, okay? Whatever that is, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has to be less likely to be true. Why? Because it's an innovation on top of Christianity. Like, Christianity is nonsense, so then Mormonism has to be absolute nonsense because it's, you understand, it's just another hypothesis. Isn't that simple? It means whenever you...
The Jehovah's Witnesses some actual more credit than maybe Catholic, because when I speak to them, they agree with you on some things. They go, oh, he didn't say he was the Son of God.
Right. They don't believe in the Trinity. So they're a walkback. Right. I'm with you. Right. They're a walkback. Right. But they are Christians, and Christianity is an accretion on top of Judaism. It's a breakaway. They all will say it. Yes. Judaism, that means what they all have in common is they will say that Judaism wants true. Like Islam is very close to Judaism in its radical monotheism. It's understanding that that God forgives people who repent without anybody dying for their sins, so they can't stand Paul and that kind of stuff. But it is axiomatic Everyone has to be on board on this one. It is absolutely axiomatic that any accretion, any hypothesis on top of Judaism just has to be less likely, and the burden of evidence is on them. And now it's true that this is very convenient for me as an Orthodox Jew, but it just has to be correct that the doctrine of the Trinity is a later Christian invention. We know who invented it. We know who came up with the name. We know when the church decided that was orthodox. We know this. This is all transparent. So if someone out there is saying, look, I have a feeling there might be something bigger than us out there, there's a higher power out there. We also live in a world of knowledge of science. That means you and your dog share like 98% of your DNA. That means it's all the same stuff we now know, just rebuilt. We're walking protoplasm. Hydrogen is the most plentiful element out there. It means we now know. Like I don't know to what level of certainty you possess on being agnostic, or maybe there is a God, right? But it's very clear to you, I am sure, this is presumptuous, that, look, at the end of the day, there either is one God who's behind all the laws of physics, who's behind it all, some higher power, or there's no God. But polytheism is untenable because we know too much about science, right? No matter where you are on the scale of, right? Does that make sense?
So to me, although I believe there's no creation, I don't bet that there is a singular being that created everything. One thing that is very hard for me to argue with is Spinoza, the famous Sephardic philosopher, who said that he was famously ejected from his synagogue for saying that the God was the identity of the universe, the eternity. That's something I could agree with. And then when it comes to polytheism being ridiculous, for me, the most plausible scientific superior being I can believe in, it would be extraterrestrials, and they would be several of them. And so I guess it's almost both. Like, to me, the grand question is probably, I think eternity, the universe itself is amazing. I see patterns all the time. I see patterns just in the timing when I spoke to you. Everything seems to match up. I don't see things as boring and stale. I think the world's amazing, but I see it as these books are written by man and they're beautiful. They're reaching into the history. I'm so interested, and I think something needs to be in the place of it if we're going to move on. There's so much redeemable value. So it's a complicated answer for me.
As I said, the Torah is making highly falsifiable claims about the Jewish people and our history. I'd encourage you, when you have time, read Deuteronomy 4, how the nations, you talked about how the majority of the world believes that the Jewish faith was once true. They believe that our holy literature, they all believe that Isaiah was a prophet. Well, the Torah actually in Deuteronomy 4 predicts this, says all the nations of the world will look at you, the Jews, and go, what a wise nation this is that has such a Torah. Yet, the text says, they'll hate you, they'll expel you from the lands, you'll be few in number, verse 27 of Deuteronomy 4, but one day you'll come back. You see, so these are highly falsified. This is not Matthew 24. This is not the Olivet Discourse where it's so vague. There'll be wars and rumors of wars. What does that mean? This is very specific about a nation that would remain few in number, that would ultimately return back, that the world would adopt our Torah as a holy work and marvel at the wisdom of this nation, yet be very uncomfortable with us. And the same chapter in verse 32 pleads with you, the reader, ask yourself, from all times gone by, has any other nation seen such a thing, made such claims on a national scale, a national revelation? Only you have been shown this, you know. So the Jews are a witness people to the world, a light to the nations. And I encourage people who are struggling with faith to go, okay, let's just go back to this text and not use Rabbi Google. That would be a mistake. But and to realize that when people say and people that say Moses didn't exist, it's just silly. I don't know why people would, you can't know that. I don't know why they say that as though they have access. That's just silly. They can't know that. So just ask the question. Let's go back to the original monotheism and then look at the text. The text is making highly falsifiable claims. This is not Nostradamus, where it just can be interpreted any way. This is very specific about this very specific people. And here we are today. Jews have returned to their land, and I encourage people to say, I'm going to think about that. That's all. It's really that simple. And any of the later claim of new revelation is under the burden of evidence. Christianity and Judaism are not equals. Christianity is claiming that Judaism once true. The burden of evidence on all their vacuous claims that's a fantastic claim that there's some new covenant. Well, the Torah says you can't add or take away, Deuteronomy 4:2.
You have the advantage over anyone offering new scripture.
Yeah.
I think there's two things I would react to. So there was a development of the Torah itself. So like some people say the book of Daniel is a forgery. I've seen you in your writings say, no, that is the word of God. So there's people that say like, oh, well, this part is the newest part of the Torah. Why isn't that dismissed? And then before that, if we reach even further back, there is evidence that of the pre-Jewish belief system, Yahwehism, and the Babylonian religion. We already went over all the similarities to that. People say, well, there was a pantheon, which actually the Torah, this isn't a surprise, it actually talks about the older beliefs in the Torah, such as Yashara, the goddess, who had all these idols that the Torah says to go out and get rid of these idols that people worship. And so people might say, well, there's an older pre-Abrahamic belief. I don't know if it's pre-Abrahamic, but pre-Torah system. Why shouldn't I, by your logic, there's nothing really, we don't have the scripture, but like, why shouldn't I assume that was the right thing, that there was a pantheon of gods?
Yeah, but they're strawmanning this. That means no one claims that prior to the Torah, giving the Torah, there were no monotheists. So they're attacking a shadow, a ghost. It means Noah was a righteous person who very much knew what the Torah said. For example, I plead with the viewers to read Genesis 6 and 7, where Noah is told, take two animals, male, female, bring them on the ark. We talked about the flood earlier. But he said, of the clean animals, take 7, because you're going to bring sacrifices later. Well, that means Noah knew about the law of Moses, knew about Leviticus 11 long before it was written. I mean, they knew murder was the mother lode of bad ideas. So what they're doing is they're strawmanning this. I think people need to go back to the original text, read it for themselves. It was all well known to the children of Israel, and it is a national revelation that's the foundation of our faith, and the resurrection of the dead was unheard of in the ancient world. The physical resurrection of the dead was unheard of. Only the Jews believed that. Paul was uncomfortable with that. The Gospels ultimately will bring that back for Jesus, but ultimately, people have to go back to the original faith, the Jewish faith, go back to the Torah and go, okay, the Torah's making predictions about history. Let's see how it does. I think it does really well.
I will add one thing. There was one other monotheistic religion I know about, the Akhenatism. The pharaoh Akhenaten in Egypt momentarily had a singular god, Aten, who was the sun, but it was short-lived. But just as an exception, just to provide an exception, there was one other monotheistic religion I can think of.
That was a little bit more like a one-God system rather than a monotheistic system. It was more like a henotheistic system, where there was one great God, but there were other minor deities. So, but if you look at, as an example, Isaiah 45, verse 5, that there's nothing else, there's no other divine agency besides God. So that's really very unique. There's nothing like me. Nehemiah chapter 9, verse 6, Atu Hashem levadecha, you alone are God. So that's an absolute radical monotheism. I mean, there were many nations that believed that there was one great God, as you mentioned, one example. I can think of many, but not that there's no other creator, no other power except God. That's really quite unique. Look, this is fascinating. I encourage people to study the topic. And, thank you for having me on.
As I said, you guys don't have a sales division. And so there's not a lot of people that want to have that discussion. A lot of people there's a lot of opinionated rabbis that know everything, but you are a machine, and I just appreciate your show, especially you on Myth Vision. I'm a big fan of, and your writing. So thank you so much for doing what you're doing, because I think it's a very noble cause.
Absolute joy. Thank you so much for having me on. If you enjoyed this program, please like and subscribe.
אדון עולם אשר מלך בטרם כל יציר נברא לעת נעשה בחפצו כל